The mansion sat at the top of the hill like a prize that had been won and preserved. Lawns rolled away in careful green, fountains whispered in appointed places, and the valet knew before the watch did which evening coat would hang on which hanger. Inside those polished corridors lived a little girl who had never spoken a single word. People in the neighborhood whispered the story like they were discussing weather. The doctor's notes were folded away in locked drawers. The therapists had left their cards on the fridge and then stopped calling. She laughed sometimes, a small sound, bright as a coin, and she could show love with honest, aching eyes that tracked the world like someone trying to memorize it. But when people asked her a simple question, her mouth stayed closed and her hands folded together like a secret. Her father was a man who could buy governments if he liked. His suits cost more than many people's homes. He had built an empire from clever deals and a stubborn refusal to be wrong. He hired the best doctors, the best teachers, the best everything. He believed money could bend all outcomes, except the one that mattered most, getting his daughter to say dad, or mom, or even hello. They tried everything from speech therapists with gentle voices to machines that promised to coax the tongue. Each attempt was clinical and dutiful. They watched charts and progress notes and left with polite smiles. The girl, whose life had been cushioned from any real hardship, learned to read the world through the net of people who tried too hard to repair her. On the other side of town, where the city remembered a harder history, the garbage truck rolled the same route every Monday and Thursday. The driver was a man whose hands had the particular weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, small scars, knuckles like split rope, palms with a map of grease and kindness. He wore an old green jacket and a cap that had lost its original color a dozen winters ago. His name was Matteo, but the kids in his neighborhood called him the Music Man because he hummed a lot and kept time with his feet. Matteo had been a carpenter until his knees decided otherwise. He had sung in a church choir once and taught a handful of kids guitar for spare change. Life had not been generous to his ambitions, but it had taught him to notice people. He had a peculiar habit. He watched lips. He put his attention on mouths the way a botanist studies buds. Maybe this came from working with tools. Observing the smallest nuance mattered. Maybe it was the leftover from his guitar lesson patience, the way he waited for a string to settle before plucking again. One Thursday, as fate shortened his breath and rearranged ordinary days into meetings, Matteo's truck rumbled past the $1,000,000 house. He'd been doing this route for months now, a steadiness in his hands and a nod to the gardener when he passed. He'd glimpsed the girl through a wide window before, a pale face at the glass, curious, eyes that drank light. He had waved like he waved to all the neighborhood children, his mouth shaping a simple, open greeting. She had looked, and then she did something that made him drive the truck up the hill again and slow to a stop. From then on, Matteo timed his rounds to pass the house when the girl was often on the porch. He discovered ritual in the timing of her life. Her nurse watered the window box after breakfast at 9. A tutor arrived at 2. Matteo learned the schedule like a map of rituals and planted his small, ordinary defiance between those times. He started to bring small things in his route. A single daisy on its stem, a smooth pebble, the leftover strap from a guitar he could no longer play. He left them on the porch along with a little note, a dot of charcoal on a scrap of paper, a spiral he'd sketched. Whoever collected them would find them later, as if a secret had been left in their mailbox. The household staff noticed the objects and grew nervous. The father asked the gardener if anyone had seen who left them. The gardener shrugged. People in uniforms sometimes leave unexpected gifts. But the girl noticed. She picked up the pebble and held it, turning it over as if listening to a story only it could tell. Then Matteo did something braver. He started to sing as the truck came up the hill, not loud, not a show, a gentle, humming tune in an unremarkable key. It was carved from the lullabies his mother had sung and the gospel refrains from the small church where he'd learned to keep rhythm. It had the cadence of someone counting steps on a porch. The first time, the girl's head tilted and she pursed her lips, as if tasting a note with her mouth. Music had been a language for Matteo, and he trusted it to do what words could not. He had seen a shy man open up with a chorus, had seen neighbors settle after a long argument because someone brought out a familiar melody. He did not know why he thought it might work with his child, but he felt a certainty the way one feels a nail find wood. On a rainy afternoon when the driveway looked like the gloss of a piano, Matteo walked up the path carrying nothing but a broom because the truck's hydraulics were noisy, and he didn't want to frighten anyone. He found the girl on the porch bench, a small figure wrapped in a blanket, watching the rain like it was writing letters on the glass. He stood 2 yards away and started to whistle a tune, a simple scale bending down into warmer notes. She watched him as if studying a specimen, lips parted a fraction. He nodded to her slowly, then pointed to his mouth and tapped his chest. He made a hollow sound and then tapped the broom like a drum. He sang the pattern again, a rhythm made of taps and hums. The staff inside looked out and tensed, unsure if etiquette could handle whatever was happening. Matteo didn't ask for permission. He made a circle of patience and invited her in with a song. He clapped once, twice, letting the sound roll up the wooden porch. The girl smiled, an honest light, and then she tapped the wood with her palm. Her hand moved awkwardly but sure, and the pattern came back to him like an echo. A tiny conversation unfolded. He tapped, she tapped. He whistled. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as if experimenting with breath. The nurse hovered in the doorway, watching a miracle shape itself in the quiet space between two people. The girl's father, alerted by the staff, appeared like a man walking into an unfamiliar church. He stood rigid, and an anger that wasn't wholly his for being excluded pricked at him. Then something unexpected happened. The girl, who had never given her voice to the world, opened her mouth for a long breath. A sound came out. Not a word, not yet. It was a bright, startled note, a thread of something that had been knitted into silence. Matteo stopped tapping, listened, and when the sound trembled again, he smiled like someone who had been given a key. He tapped the rhythm once more, slower now, and hummed a single easy syllable. He said nothing. He sang. The girl tried again, and this time the sound had shape. The nurse cried softly. The father crossed the porch and did not say a word. He could not. Money has the power to fix many things, but it had not given him this sight, a father watching the rawness of first sound. In the days that followed, he visited every morning. He learned the girl's favorite small movements. He left behind a rhythm of predictable presence. The staff debriefed and fretted, but the girl began to respond. She started forming small sounds that were half syllables and half the notes he hummed. It was a language born of patience, not prescription. Neighbors came to watch from polite distances. People began to say the garbage man had worked a miracle. The father, who had been suspicious, found himself standing in the doorway late at night, listening to his daughter hum a tune she'd been practicing with the man who emptied the city's trash. He had to admit, without pride, that his world had been too tidy to hold this kind of messy grace. The breakthrough came one evening when the backyard filled with the smell of grilled meat and the family had guests. A cousin, loud with laughter and inexpert with children, leaned over and tried to get the girl's attention with a silly face. She looked away, resisting the flash of spectacle. Matteo, who hadn't planned to come that day, happened to be passing by and heard the commotion. He stopped at the gate and offered a small rhythm with his hands. The cousin made another silly face. The girl shook her head. Matteo stepped to the porch and tapped the 6-beat pattern they'd used since winter. The girl watched for a long second, and then, as if the years of silence were a knitted sweater unwinding, she opened her mouth and said a single word. It wasn't Dad. It wasn't an honorary pronouncement. She said again. It was the most ordinary miracle the father had ever seen. The word itself was small, a child wanting repetition. The sound lodged into the air and made everyone reconsider how much had been lost in the blink of a diagnosis. The cousin who had been joking gaped, the staff sobbed into their hands, and Matteo, who had spent decades lifting what others threw away, looked like a man who had found the place he was meant to stand. From that day, more words came, not in a flood, but like water finding cracks and seeping through. Therapists returned, and the man with the tailored suits listened to their suggestions with a new humility. He learned to stand back and let someone else's ordinary bravery reshape his life. Matteo refused money when it was offered with trembling hands. He refused anything that would make his presence transactional. All he accepted was a bowl of soup now and the girl's hand in his when they walked together down the driveway to the gate. Years later, the girl's voice became a familiar instrument in the house. She sang at the table, arguing about which pie was better and reading aloud from stories that smelled of dust and of newness. Her father watched her like a man who had been given a second world. He kept Matteo's old green cap on a peg by the door, a monument to a kindness that could not be bought. People still said the thing they'd always said about the house on the hill. It was perfect. But the truth was different and far better. The mansion had a place where laughter and raw strings of voice lived because a man who collected what others discarded had carried with him the best salvage of all: patience, rhythm, and the courage to notice a mouth trying to learn its first words. Matteo continued to do his rounds, his truck moving through neighborhoods like a steady heartbeat. He hummed new tunes and left pebbles on porches where children liked to find small surprises. He never boasted. He never claimed a trophy. The girl's father occasionally met him at the gate, and they would talk in the clumsy, grateful language of men who had both lost and been found. On certain mornings, if you walked by the hill at dawn, you could hear the girl practicing with a broomstick as a drum and Matteo whistling from a street. The sound carried down the slope like a promise. Ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and in the smallest of gestures, a life could be rearranged towards speech, towards laughter, towards a room full of sound. They found small joy and kept it like a light.